In 2017, I had heard news of people dressing up as clowns and running around with knives at night. I typically brushed those things off, though, because I had my own problems at the time. I was 20 years old and often up all hours of the night, dealing with my screaming newborn. It was in the early months of the year, so we still had some snow and I wasn't able to get out of the house often. Taking out the trash, which was located at the back door, was usually the most fresh air I got. One morning when I was taking out the trash, I happened to glance over to the right and noticed footprints directly under the window to my baby's room. I walked over to inspect, and not only were those footprints, but there was also hand indentations on the window screen. It was weird, but the baby slept in my room, so I wasn't as concerned. But at that moment, my boyfriend was losing his marbles. Fast forward a couple days, and I was up around 3 a.m., and I heard not exactly what I would call screaming, but more of a screeching howl. We have a lot of stray cats, and I kind of thought that that's what it was and just ignored it. Once the sun was up, I looked out the window and noticed a few new sets of footprints that really didn't make sense because it looked like someone had just gone passing between the houses. But again, I blew it off because we had a drug house across the street and we've had people cross through our yard before to get to that house. Maybe 4 nights later, again at 3 a.m., I was breastfeeding and I heard a dragging noise against the house. From where I was sitting on my couch, I could see the back door. The back door had a window with blinds on it, and it didn't really seal well due to the wood rot on the frame. I paused the TV and listened, just to hear it again, now directly at the back door. Looking over, I could clearly see a looming figure just standing there at the window. It was holding on to one of those big kitchen knives, and granted the blinds were shut, so I'm seeing a creepy shadow version of this. He ran the knife across the window panes before softly knocking. Meanwhile, I'm trying to figure out what to do. I have a newborn latched and my phone's in the bedroom, and something in me doesn't want whoever this is out of my sight. So I stood up and readjusted because I didn't want a screaming baby. I walked into the kitchen, flicked the light on, and just said loud enough for him to hear me. "Hey man, I called the police, and I'm sure you don't want to deal with them, so why don't you just go home?" I don't know why I talked to him so calmly and normally, but I don't think he was expecting anyone to say anything because he just froze. I think he talked it over with himself after, because he darted it down the alleyway. I've never had anything like this happen again, but my boyfriend was sure mad I didn't wake him up to handle the situation, or at least actually call the police. I decided to drive to the largest forest in my county in hopes of getting back in touch with nature. Needing to clear my head, I asked the local forestry office the best place for a quick walk off the main trails. I was directed to this beautiful spot that was a little ways down the road. There was no reception with the rare bit of blue sky we get in the UK. I was glad I made the spontaneous trip, and I walked further down the path and I saw a clearing of trees to my right. Since the plan was to get closer with nature, I ventured into the trees off the beaten path. It was great. I explored the area, listened to the birds as they swooped from branch to branch. I even got a good 5-minute meditation in. I unexpectedly reached the sand road as I emerged from the trees, but decided to walk along it for a moment as I scanned for an entry into the forest on the other side. But as I looked around, I spotted a bra dangling from a bush near the road. Now I'm aware people go into the forest for all sorts of reasons, but this did slightly put me on edge. As I turned around, I heard an electric car making its way up the road. By the time I heard it, it was less than 300 yards away. My instincts told me to hide or just avoid being seen, but there was no time, so I simply gave a polite nod as he passed and made his way in the opposite direction. He parked up behind me, just out of view. I began to make my way off the road, intending to explore further, but when I saw the car for a moment doing a 180 turn, then parking again, something told me to turn around and go back the way I came. As I made my way back onto the road, I spotted this man in a white shirt behind the bush the bra was hanging from. He was going in the direction I just changed course from. I crossed the road and made my way back into the forest I had arrived on the sand road from. When I got slightly further in, I turned around to check if the man continued to be in the opposite direction, but he didn't. Instead, I see it also crossed the road and is making his way to the part of the woods I entered. By this point, I knew I was being followed. There was no way he coincidentally went one way and then turned to head into the part of the forest that I entered. But I kept my pace brisk rather than running. My physical health can go south quickly, but my knees are brittle and my ankles are weak. So rushing could cost me, especially since I still had to reach my car and drive away. As I traveled further away, he was still following. I was cursing my luck as I made my way to the end of the section of the forest. Just before the path, that was a large patch of grass and shrubbery. But as I looked back, I couldn't see him. I stopped for longer than I should have, just scanning the trees and listening intently. But I heard nothing and saw nothing. I made my way back onto the path with some relief and turned one last time to check the tree line. He wasn't there. I began considering if I was just overthinking the whole situation. But just as those thoughts crossed my mind, I saw the man emerge from the opposite side from where he was previously, at the edge of the tree line. He just stared at me. But I wasn't going to take any more chances, so I made my way down the path and back to my car. I made sure to get out of there quickly, and I knew he would have to head down the same tight country road. I reported the man to the forestry office, but there was not much they could do, so that was it. I'm glad I never went further into the forest, and I'm glad I followed my instincts. Otherwise, the only way back would have been through him, and only God knows what his intentions were. My wife's uncle, that we'll call Jay, bought some land just north of Spokane, Washington, with a friend of the family that we'll call Kay. They got it at a significant discount because a nearby aluminum smelter had polluted the ground and it was impossible to use the water beneath. They had set up 2 plots and each had a camper to live in. Jay had been getting progressively more paranoid and saying that people were stalking him and watching him in the trees. About 3 months into living there, a man wandering through the woods had an interaction with Jay and ended up attacking him and breaking Jay's jaw. Upon being arrested, the man said he was overcome with the desire to see if he could kill him in a single punch. Unfortunately, 2 months later, Jay was murdered in his sleep on the couch of his camper. Kay found him and immediately ran as far away as he could and called the police once he stopped. There was sufficient evidence on who did it, and they say they caught the killer, who was a 19-year-old boy who wanted to steal his bike. Kay was completely terrified at all times to be there alone. He had moved in with a family member until 8 months later, where he had nowhere else to go and had to return. He was in constant fear, and he finally convinced my pregnant wife and I to come and stay with him. The second I turned off the highway onto the property, I was overcome with a sense of dread. There was at least 250 crows covering the dirt road up into the property. I didn't sleep whatsoever the first night. All I could do was stare into the forest and just searching for the cause of my intense fear. The energy of this place was so uncomfortable, but I assumed it was just because I knew Uncle Jay was killed here. Even the days were eerie here. There was never a moment where I didn't feel watched. My wife and I always had this sense of fear, but especially after dark. Things sort of normalized for a while, until one day Kay began puking and feeling very lightheaded at the time. I took him to the hospital and they said he was fine, probably just the flu. 3 days after the anniversary of Jay's death, Kay came running out of the camper screaming that he couldn't breathe. It woke my wife and I up, and we ran out to see what was wrong. Kay had gotten into his car and floored it, crashing into a nearby tree. I ran up and peered through the window just to see the most intense and most primal fear I've ever seen in somebody's eyes. He was gasping and clutching his chest. Moments later, he breathed out one last time and he was dead. We gave him CPR for 30 minutes until EMS arrived. But on July 10th, 1 year and 3 days after him and Jay moving there, they were both dead. Now it's only me and my wife alone on the property. Every moment living in fear and not understanding what had just happened here. I don't know why we didn't just leave right away. One day I came out to get fresh water from the drum that we kept, just to be greeted with one of the worst smells I have ever smelled. The water container had a 1-inch opening on the top, and inside the water was bits and pieces of chipmunks, like spines and heads. They didn't fall in. Something ripped them apart before putting them inside. The nights were always getting worse and worse. I never saw anything. I was just filled with unease and an intense fear. One night, my wife and I returned home to having the worst feelings we've ever felt. Everything looked different, although everything was right where we left it, but nothing seemed in place. When we were looking around, I suddenly see this orange long-haired cat sitting on a stump. The cat's eyes were so intense, fiery but almost glowing, but not quite. Then we started hearing branches snapping, pine needles crunching, and seemingly from every direction, while I'm just still staring at this cat frozen in fear. Suddenly a voice breaks out, echoing through the forest. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" I thought it was a little girl, but something was off. My wife yelled back, "Hello? Are you okay? Anybody?" We yelled back several times with no response. But then someone with the most intense, shrieking, evil-sounding voice of a woman started screaming, "Help me, help me." I was filled with more intense fear than I could ever describe, but my wife was overcome with the need to help this person, and she started to head off into the forest without a word. I grabbed her by the arm and told her something wasn't right. I don't know why she wouldn't respond to us, but she tried to break free from me and go off alone. I told her to get into the truck and that I'd grab the spotlights and we aren't going on foot. We rolled the windows down and shone the intensely bright LED lights through the forest. We slowly crept down the road yelling back, and as we got further down the road, we started hearing the screaming again. Sounds are difficult to pin down in the woods, but this one was very close. I hit the brakes and stopped immediately, still searching. No sign of anyone, when suddenly the voice exploded into the cabin of the vehicle as if they were standing right outside the window. It left my ears hurting and ringing. I hit the gas and just didn't look back. I called the police when I hit the highway, and afterwards they said that no one was around when they looked. I picked up our stuff the next day, and my wife gave birth shortly after. The one thing I'll always wonder is what the hell could have done these things. I've never believed in the paranormal before, but I don't have any other explanation for it.